welcome to the Revenue Marketing Report. Our goal on the RMR is to help marketers move from subject matter experts to strategic business partner. I'm joined today by Kevin Mulrane, and I'm excited to have this conversation. Kevin, how about you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm super excited to chat today. So thank you for having me on. I am someone who's been in the sales and marketing world for about 15 years now and been in sales leadership positions, always working very closely with marketing teams, and also worked in the account-based marketing space for a little over 5 years. So seen a lot and excited to kind of share some stories and talk shop and learn.
So I have a feeling that people listening are suspecting we're going to talk about the age-old sales versus marketing, but we're doing a little bit of a twist on it that I'm excited about. You recently were looking for a new position, and one of your requirements was that sales and marketing had to work together seamlessly. How did you manage this feat?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there was a couple of things. First and foremost, I took a step back and I was very thoughtful about what I was really looking for. And I wanted to, I knew what bad looked like, and I knew what bad sales and marketing relationships look like. But I wanted to start to think about what does good look like. And because I wasn't always exposed to what good looked like, I went to my network. So I think the first thing I did was I was able to speak to a lot of different people to understand, like, what does good look like? What drives that? How do you build a really good relationship between sales and marketing? So I think that was sort of like the beginning of it. And that was the first thought process. I think the second thing was then being really clear and specific about the questions I had to ask. So as I was going through the process and I was meeting with the CEO and founder, I just had really direct questions about it, And so that I think that curiosity helped me a lot. And I think the third part of it all was just speaking to a lot of people in the organization, right? Speaking to the head of marketing, speaking to people on the marketing team, people on the sales team, even the supporting cast that works around that, just to see how the wider organization, how they collaborate, how they work together across all these different departments. So I think those are probably the three different pieces on how I approached it when I kind of embarked on that journey.
So for those listeners out there who are kind of burned out on the whole like toxic dynamic, what are some of the direct questions you were asking of the sales and marketing leadership?
I asked a lot around, first and foremost, because I think the most foundational piece that makes great sales and marketing relationships is alignment on KPIs and numbers and like, what's your North Star, right? And I think when you see two different goals and objectives, that's what creates this toxic or friction, butting of the heads. And so I started asking, how like, what do we measure? What are the metrics? What's important to the business? At the end of the quarter, how do we know sales is successful? And how do we know marketing is successful? And I was hoping to hear the same numbers, right?
Yeah,
like
revenue.
The same answer. Yeah, right? Like the same answer to those two different questions. And so that was sort of like the big foundational piece for me. And then the next was, all right, now more on like the micro, day-to-day, week-to-week, like what's in place today? How do the teams collaborate? What do they do? Right. And I was hearing a lot about there's a bi-weekly sales and marketing meeting. We have a sales and marketing unified dashboard. We're always we're going to sales for content feedback and ideas. And I just started to see like this really great culture of collaboration. And then it was, being able to speak with different members of the team, be like, hey, so like, I hear you guys do all this. How's it really playing out? Right. Like, and I wasn't really shy about it, because I wanted to, sometimes the grass isn't always greener and what you think you're signing up for isn't always the case. So I wanted to make sure I can kind of do that inspection a few layers deeper, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting because totally agree on the KPIs not being aligned, being a point of it just misalignment.
Yep.
But I think in circumstances where the two executives just kind of dislike each other, that doesn't help either. And everyone can tell they're not sneaky or not as sneaky as they think they are. So asking people within the organization, that's so smart.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. I think, the metrics is like a foundational piece to me too, but I also think it's in a way, hiring great people with like similar values, culture wise, like just different things that organically that alignment and collaboration will occur, right? part of what I wanted to understand as well is as I was going through the interview process, it was like, and I don't want to go back to like, can I have a beer with this person type thing, but it's like, but can I work with this person? Like, do I think that they're open to feedback, open to suggestions? Will they give me feedback? And do I think they can deliver feedback well? I think that's a big part of it, because you're delivering feedback, I think, is one of these like underrated pieces of like a skill that's very underrated or not spoken about enough. Because I think you can give feedback with the best intent, but sometimes the impact you have because of the way it's delivered isn't, what you hope for. And so I just wanted to like just see like, how would we collaborate? How would we work together? Do they seem open to both giving and receiving feedback? And will we just get on really well? I think that was like a big part of it. It's just personality wise, like would we align and gel?
Yeah. And I think as an interviewee, one of the questions I love asking is, give me an example of a time when your systems were not set up correctly and how you handled it. And the language they use is very telling. If they
Mm,
start talking about, well, we had this person who wasn't very good, instead of we found and we did this to solve it, that's
yep,
a huge red flag.
exactly. It's little, I think you're absolutely right. It's little ways in which they describe things. If there's a lot of I, or they, you start to think like, oh, there's just too much ownership of things, right? Where if it's us, we, the team, then you start to get a sense of, all right, like there's actual, teamwork going on versus owning, like, individual blaming, pointing fingers, or taking credit for things.
Totally. So, for those out there who are in a contentious relationship between sales and marketing, what are the kind of things people can do to help improve that relationship?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to point out when something's broken. And I think it's difficult to impact change, but there's absolutely an opportunity to do so. It starts at the top though, and I think that's where this gets really tricky and really difficult, because depending on how long you've been in the organization, depending on where your seniority level, to go to your CEO, to go to your CMO, or your head of sales, like whatever the role is, like it can be a tough thing to be like, hey, like, this is toxic and this isn't good. The way you can, and again, it sort of depends on who you're speaking to, but for both the head of the CMO or the VP of sales, whomever it is, I think if you can position it as, hey, we can drive better results by insert solution here, right? If you make it very much result driven and kind of take the emotion out of it, sometimes, again, just thinking more like a data driven approach, that may get a better response or a more open-minded response, because they see that you're trying to improve the organization, you're trying to improve the numbers, improve the results, as opposed to, well, this person thinks this and that person thinks, like, that gets into the emotion and like the friction, and people just like don't want to deal with that, right? So I think if it's very much positioned as optimistic, positive, impact change in a positive way, you'll start to catch people's ears more effectively and a bit better.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um,
Debate ideas, not people. That's a
yep,
huge one. And then always approach it from the sales perspective of what's in it for them. If you explain, hey, this error is happening and I know it's going to impact your MQL goal, but I think by doing this, we can actually uncover a lot more meetings and reduce some of the noise, and that improves your pipeline number. That's a little bit different than just saying, hey, this sucks and you need to change it.
exactly. Yeah, if it's all about, in a way, like, internally you're selling, right? Like that's what you're
Yep.
doing, and like what's the value to the person that you're speaking to, right? Why should we think about doing things a different way? Why should we change the way we're doing it today? And again, I think just people are going to think, well, selfishly, if like I get something out of right, then yeah, I'm open to it. If it makes my life better, easier, whatever it is, people will be open to changing the current behavior.
Yeah, and don't give in to your introversion if you're an introvert. There's nothing better than forming relationships with people in other departments. I think people underestimate how far that can get you. And I always say, make sure to talk to people when you don't have a problem you're bringing to them, because if you only go to people with a problem, they're going to cringe every time you come around the corner or pop up
Yep.
in Slack.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would say too is sometimes sales and marketing, like when it's very siloed, it's easy to point fingers and blame. And I think what also can help with keeping an open mind and changing perspective is walk over to the other side and start working with them and start doing a bit of the job with them, right? And as a some of the best marketers I worked with, they were like, if sales, which again, typical sales, the leads suck, right? The MQLs are garbage. Some of the best marketers are like, I'll start calling with you.
Yeah.
Right. Like, let me get on the phones. Let me speak to the leads. Let me hear and let me see it firsthand, or at least listen to call recordings and really be able to like get in there. So I think the more that you can actually walk in the, kind of like ride shotgun with your counterpart or be a part of it, the more you guys work closely together, the better you're going to start to see eye to eye, as opposed to very distantly, oh, these leads are garbage. And then, no, they're great. And, I think it's just trying to find like a middle ground of working together and walking the same path together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of those things is my mantra has always been, I don't make my number unless sales makes their number. And sometimes we start out with a startup who needs awareness, and that's what sales is asking for. Whenever I call somebody, they don't know who we are. I have to explain the whole thing. So we get awareness, but that doesn't necessarily immediately trickle down into pipeline. So then the next thing I start hearing is, hey, people hear about us, which is great, but we're not getting a lot of inbound. So then you have to switch your attention to lead gen. But if you're not listening to them, you don't understand that, okay, we've achieved what we needed to achieve here. Let's switch our focus a little bit. So talking to people is just, there's no replacement for it.
Yeah, no, it's so important. I think, again, it's just one of those things that just has to happen more, right? And to the example you used as well, I think there's just like expectation setting on time, right? Like, especially on the early stage startup, I've seen it so many times where it's like, no one knows who we are. So we have to go out and build the brand, build the recognition.
Yep.
Oh, but where's my 150 customers? And you're like, well, these things, like some of these things take time, right? Yep. And if you do certain tactics and understanding, so I think that's where really clear expectations and alignment is understood and then communicated from the top. I think that's where like there's still a bit of disconnect in a lot of organizations that then creates that anxiety and that fear where marketing is like, oh, like we're doing brand, and sales is like, well, where's my meetings, where's my leads, where's my revenue? And that also is where some of that friction's caused.
And I don't want to give the impression that if awareness is working, you stop doing that. It's just that, great, it's working. Let's set it and forget it for a little while so we can focus on this area. And exactly. That's if you have a lot of resource constraint. Obviously, yep. If you have people specializing, then you can focus on both.
Exactly. Yep.
So let's talk through a common sticky situation, or at least it was common to both of us when we were talking earlier.
Yep.
So as a person in sales or marketing ops, I was often asked to pull the numbers for the other team. And then those were used to call the work of the other team into question in an executive meeting. And my nightmare, and this happened so many times, was Camela said, and then that was used against the other team. Eventually I figured out how to navigate this, but how have you navigated this in the past?
Yeah, it's such a tricky one, and unfortunately is very, very common. But I think the first thing is transparency on an agreed upon, like a common sales and marketing dashboard, right? And not having, ooh, I created my set of reports and you have yours and I'm checking up on your, like, you should have a person who owns the building of the reports, and then there's complete transparency across the entire organization to those reports. And I think having that sort of just general understanding is super important from the get-go. And if me as the sales leader says, hey, I really want to have this report, well, then that has to sort of go through the person that owns all the reporting, has to be kind of brought to make sure, like, yes, this does make sense to add into this dashboard, or yes, it's a metric that is important to the business to help us optimize things and make them better, not get somebody in trouble.
Yeah.
Right. So really understand like the purpose of each metric and data point. Again, I think it's easy to fall into that, paralysis by analysis, and you can look at every little number in the world, and then all of a sudden you're like, what do you start to do here?
Hmm.
So it's like agreeing upon those key metrics that they're going to lead the business and help you define success or areas of optimization. And then I think the last bit of it is, this consistent like reviewing and talking about those numbers
Hmm.
with everybody in the room, right? So having a sales and marketing collaboration meeting where you're looking at the numbers that you've agreed upon, that everyone has visibility to the reports. And that's where you have these conversations around not just what the numbers are saying, but what are they telling you? What can you pull from it? Where can you optimize? And then, of course, action plans and accountability moving forward on what you need to go do.
Yeah, and how I corrected that is exactly along the lines of what you were saying. Digging into, okay, is this a timing issue or do we not agree on the definition of, let's say, an MQL?
Yep.
In our case, we didn't agree on the definition of an MQL. So then you have to go through the work of defining and getting business buy off on it. If you skip that step, you're just asking for a fight. You really are. And then the other thing was, I realized I was in sales ops at the time and I realized marketing wasn't looking at their numbers. So when a bad quarter came along, the sales exec was super smart. He wanted to get his like business case together of why it wasn't their fault that they didn't hit their number. And so I'd go over to marketing and say, hey, you guys, before I talk to the sales guy, hey, this is what I'm seeing. You need to be prepared for it. What can I do to help? And that went a really long ways in developing some teamwork between sales and marketing. Like the executives may not get along, but at least we did at the functional level.
Yeah. And I think, in a way, again, it kind of goes back to just the culture of the team of what you're building, where in a way you have to have people that don't like accuse someone first of something in a way, right? Like almost like always go in with the benefit of the doubt, go in with like a collaboration mindset. And I think too, like especially in that operations role, which can really sometimes be a difficult role because you're trying to like, kind of play the parent between the two children that are fighting. Like you have to,
Mm-hmm.
make sure everyone's playing nice in the sandbox. So that's an interesting, kind of challenge you have there, because people will take a bit of, just passion in their job and their result, where you're like the reporting data numbers. So I'm interested to kind of hear more about how you've navigated those relationships, kind of being that third party, not tied to one or the other necessarily.
Yeah, I'd always say I was Switzerland. you know, like people would start arguing. I'm like, hey, I'm Switzerland. Here's what the data says. So both of you are right.
Yep.
Like you're both seeing issues that need to be corrected. But I think so much of navigating that was actually forming relationships with the sales and marketing leaders. And that's what I miss about being in the office. I would have a schedule where I would stop by. I had a day of the week that I'd pick and I'd go surprise an executive first thing in the morning before they had all their meetings, before they had any fires, and just say, hey, how are the kids?
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
And then so many times what came out of that was, hey, I heard from so and so that this isn't working. And then I'll look into it. No problem.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wild though. It's such an important thing just to keep those just random kind of drive-bys going,
Yes.
because all like there's so many times like, oh, like I kind of heard through this and you're just like, it's like all these like kind of like little whispers that are going around, and being able to service it through these little drop-ins is kind of nice.
It was so funny because we used to joke that sales gossips like a knitting circle because because word of mouth was always the most dangerous thing. So if somebody heard,
Yep.
like, and I have the raised eyebrow, if somebody heard that something was happening, you're like, okay, I have to do public relations control and go dig into
Oh,
what was going on. Like, you have to take it seriously.
absolutely. No, and just it's unfortunate, but it's part of it. But like just managing those personalities and the whispers and this and that, like it's a real part of the job.
Oh my God. Yeah, I had this one sales manager who was convinced that marketing was fixing their numbers. It actually turned out they were, but but later on, this guy,
Yeah.
he just trended towards negative, so you always kind of had to dig in and see what was really happening. But yeah, yeah. The dysfunctional home show is always really fun, which brings me to the question, at what point do you cut your losses?
I mean, so that's like it's a really, really big and a tough question. There's not an easy answer to it. I think so. The first thing I would start with is just straight up like your own well-being. Like, are you mentally, like, are you all right? Are you hanging in there? The moment it's starting to impact your health, your mental health, any of those things, it's affecting you personally, that is a clear sign of like it went way too far and it's time
Thank you.
to, right? So like that's kind of like the first thing I would start with.
Thank you for saying that, because I think a lot of people don't acknowledge that everyone has physical health, they have mental health too. And we're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
robots. Let's acknowledge that some of this can be really detrimental to our mental health.
And I think it's also acknowledging like whatever your job and profession is, right? Like I sell software. I'm not a brain surgeon. Like if I mess up, no one's dying, right? Like
Yeah.
put something, and I think having that moment of like perspective and priorities, it's always important to do that. But I think so taking it to the next level, I think it's, is there is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Do you see the ability to impact positive change? Right. And if you do, and you really believe in the people, you really believe in the product, you really believe in the vision, right? Like if there's something that's holding you there, if you feel like you are doing really, really great work with whatever your company does, if there's something that's really holding you there and you feel like there's the ability to make positive change, absolutely go for it. Right. But if you're not doing well mentally, if you are not really that tied and attached to the organization, like what you do, how you help, the problems you solve as a business, your mission vision, like if there's nothing that you're very passionate behind, there's nothing wrong with popping your head up and having conversations. And I think that's why this is one of the really big benefits of going out and building your network of people.
Yeah.
Whether it's different like sales and marketing communities that are out there, being a bit more present on different social platforms. But I do think that building your network is super important for, this is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. And there's so many online communities too where people can get additional support and ideas. Like the Growth Ops community, there's the RevOps Co-op. There's so many great organizations out there where people can lean on each other for support and ideas on how to navigate something tricky. I kind of always say that in tech, the expectation is that you're at a place for at least 18 months. So try to make it the 18 months, but always keep an eye on, like, do you wake up in the morning and dread starting work? That's a red flag. And life's
Yeah.
short, like you got to
Yeah.
look out for yourself because you're the only one who's really doing that.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And it's tough. It's so funny because I read an article a while back, but it was just around like the average tenure of a VP of sales. And it was just like, it went from like 24 months to 18. I think the last I saw was something like 16 months. But I remember my last company, when I got to a year and a half, I was like, beat the average. Like I'm right at
Nailed
the
it.
average. Right? Yeah. Right. Like I had a little clap for myself, but I think, it's a really, it's honestly, it's a kind of a smart thing because it's crazy because you do have to look out for your career, right? And it's really wild, but I've heard so many horror stories about companies and the way that they manage people, treat people, how teams collaborate, right? Like I've heard so many horror stories where to a point where I'm like, this can't be true, right? And so it's a really, really tough spot to be in sometimes. Where like, man, I've been here 6 months. Like if I make a jump now, it's going to look horrible on my resume.
Mm-hmm.
And again, partially ties back to that, like building that network, because if you have people that are like, that can vouch for you, can explain that, right? Like it's easier to leave a very toxic environment when you have a supporting cast of people that really have got your back, that are looking out for you and may have great connections of their own, where it's like, hey, I know this person, I can connect you guys, and I can
Yeah.
totally vouch and explain this. And there's a bit more trust and credibility there. But it's a really tough thing. And as I hear these horror stories and I see that there are some of these just like really, really toxic places to be, it's actually changed my perspective a bit too, from a hiring side of things, where a couple of years ago, if I just saw someone really hopping around a lot from a resume, I'd be like, nope, like don't even talk to them,
Yep.
like massive
Yep.
red flag, right? But I've it's changed. Like even for me, it's changed a bit where I'm like, you know what, like there's some really good things here. Like, let me investigate this a bit further. Like, let me give them a shot because it's not always on them, like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Because
wild though.
we were talking before we recorded, and I shared the story where I had two executives trolling each other on social media in a meeting. And I would never tell anybody about that during the interview process because reality is stranger than fiction, like it just
Yep.
doesn't sound like it would be real, but it definitely does happen.
Yeah, it's wild. Like that was one when you told me that, I was like, man, like that's another one of these like wild, crazy stories that you couldn't really imagine happening, but like but it does. It really, really does. And I think when you're in a spot where you're looking at the organization, you're like, man, like, what do I do? It's a really tough thing to navigate,
Mm-hmm.
and it can become really, really stressful.
Yeah.
But I think, again, kind of going back to like some of the communities you mentioned, there's so many people that have gone through that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like there really, really are. So having people you can just reach out to, talk to, share ideas, ask questions, see how they've done it. It's really important because the sad part is that it happens a lot. Right?
Yeah.
Like that's the part. The good part is that you've got people that can help you out.
It's funny. I joke that dating is learning what you can't live with. and I feel like it's kind of similar for finding a company where you can stay for a while, is really learning what impacts you in a negative way and what you need in to make it a positive environment. So for me, that's somebody who really understands and appreciates the value of ops, a boss that is interested in elevating your career,
Yep.
and sales and marketing teams that get along.
Exactly. And I think like on that as well, and I've been bad at this personally, but like I would always put so much of my own like self-worth applying it to my professional career and like how I'm doing. Like, I could be the best father, the best husband, but if I miss quota, I'm down the dumps, like, and I think another thing that I'm seeing some people do more and more of, which is inspiring for me, is like their job is kind of like a vehicle for them to live the life they want to live.
Yeah.
Right. And so, some people are great at being like, this provides me the life I want, and I can like put up with stuff. Like I don't get too drawn into it because it allows me to do all the other things that I want in my personal life. And they have such a great sense of like, no, this is so like my life, my happiness, what I do is so much more important than my professional, like who I am as a profession. And so I'm seeing more and more of that. And I think it's really cool.
It's so important. Kevin, thank you so much for being a guest. I really enjoyed our conversation. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely on LinkedIn. So please, pretty active there. So reach out to me, connect, send me a message. I always love doing these because I tend to have people who, for one reason or other, like will reach out to me and want to talk about whatever the topic was. And I think this is one that I talk about quite a bit, and I feel like it's really helpful for folks. So if anyone wants to talk about a crazy, wild situation they're in, or opinions, ideas, please reach out. Would always love to connect.
And if you collect enough of these stories, you could always write a book.
It's gonna happen one day, or there's gonna be like some sort of like parody Instagram account about how sales and marketing just never get along.
Yes. Yeah. I love it. Well, folks, if you want more great content like this, check out calibermind.com.